Have you ever stopped to think about the power a speech can have? How a few words spoken at the right moment can move crowds, change laws, and shape generations? In this video, we're diving into the most iconic speeches of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and exploring why they still speak so loudly today. If you study communications, literature, history, or are simply passionate about great speeches, you'll discover how leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Fannie Lou Hamer mastered the art of persuasion as a form of resistance. More than just revisiting famous quotes, we'll break down how these speeches were constructed, how they were crafted, the impact they had, and what we can learn from them. After all, how do you communicate a revolution? And how do these voices from the past continue to echo through the challenges of the present? To truly understand the weight of these speeches, we need to remember the context in which they emerged. We're talking about a deeply divided United States, where segregation laws restricted Black Americans' access to education, transportation, voting, essentially full citizenship. The 1960s were marked by marches, clashes, and tireless activism rising up against centuries of institutionalized oppression. At that time, speaking out was an act of bravery in itself. Simply using one's voice in public squares, churches, or courtrooms became a form of resistance. Every speech carried the urgency of the moment and the responsibility of representing millions demanding change. The power of rhetoric during that era wasn't just about persuasion. It was about inspiring, organizing, and mobilizing. In a world without social media or digital platforms, spoken word was the main tool for connecting leaders to communities. It was in this tense but fertile environment that the speeches we analyze came to life. They weren't written to sound beautiful. They were written to change the world. And in many cases, they did. When we talk about civil rights speeches, it's impossible not to start with Martin Luther King Jr., not just because of the impact of his words, but because of how he crafted a new language of hope. His I Have a Dream speech, delivered in 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial, became a symbol of the fight for equality and is still studied today as a prime example of oratory. So what makes this speech so powerful? King didn't just describe a future vision. He drew on symbols deeply rooted in American culture: the Declaration of Independence, the Bible, patriotic songs, and reinterpreted them to demand racial justice. This had a dual effect. It moved people emotionally, and it challenged the system using its own words. He used repetition: I have a dream. Vivid metaphors: the dark valley of segregation versus sunlit path of justice, and strategic pauses to create an almost musical cadence. It was poetry with a purpose. King also knew how to use the setting and moment to his advantage. The March on Washington wasn't just about hearing a speech, it was about making history. His words blended intellect, emotion, and spirituality in an accessible yet layered way. Studying this speech means more than analyzing powerful rhetoric. It's understanding how to build a narrative that lasts for decades and inspires generations. It's a true manual on how oratory can mobilize, inspire, and transform. If Martin Luther King Jr. represented the dream of peaceful integration, Malcolm X brought the raw reality and the urgent need for racial awareness. His speeches didn't ask, they demanded, and that's where his strength lay. Unlike King's conciliatory tone, Malcolm's rhetoric was direct, provocative, and often uncomfortable. Precisely because it touched wounds society preferred to ignore. One striking example is his 1964 speech, The Ballot or the Bullet. In it, Malcolm frames his rhetoric around a stark choice. Either civil rights would be achieved democratically through the ballot, or resistance would escalate through the bullet. He wasn't calling for violence outright, but he made it clear that dignity was non-negotiable. Malcolm's style was sharp, almost journalistic. He spoke clearly, quickly, and with strong logical appeal. He exposed contradictions, dismantled empty promises, and questioned the very foundation of the U.S. democratic system. And in doing so, he spoke directly to a population tired of waiting. He also turned his personal journey into a political argument. A man who had been imprisoned found faith behind bars and reinvented himself as a thinker. His story became a rhetorical weapon. He was impossible to ignore. Analyzing Malcolm X's speeches means engaging with a kind of oratory that doesn't soften the blow. It provokes. it awakens. It demands a reaction. And that is why it is essential to understanding the range of voices in the civil rights movement. While Malcolm X spoke with the force of an urban leader, Fannie Lou Hamer touched people's hearts with the honesty of someone who lived every injustice. Her most famous speech, delivered at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, is a powerful example of how emotional truth can hit harder than technical rhetoric. "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." That simple, direct line summed up not just her experience, but that of millions of Black Americans in the South. She spoke of beatings, threats, and humiliation, all with a remarkable calm. But it was a burning calm, one that made the audience feel every word. Fannie Lou didn't rely on elaborate metaphors or classical rhetoric. Her power came from transparency. She wasn't a trained politician, but her personal testimony became a public indictment. She spoke as a farmer, a poor Black woman, and turned her individual story into a mirror of a collective struggle. Her lived reality dismantled any illusion that racism was just an isolated issue. Her presence at that convention, challenging the electoral system that had excluded her, was an act of rhetorical and political courage. She didn't just represent the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She was the voice of the voiceless. That's why when studying civil rights speeches, we must include Fannie Lou Hamer. She represents the grassroots power of the struggle. If the speeches of the civil rights movement still resonate today, it's because their words didn't just inform, they transformed. And that has everything to do with the rhetorical techniques these leaders used, paired with emotional force that made it impossible to stay indifferent. Repetition, for example, was a powerful tool. King's "I Have a Dream" or "How Long? Not Long" are classic examples. Repetition not only reinforces a message, but creates a rhythm that captivates attention and anchors memory. Contrast was another frequent device. Freedom versus oppression, justice versus brutality, hope versus fear. These binary structures didn't oversimplify. They dramatized, and that was key to holding the audience's attention, especially in a context of resistance. Personalization was another crucial strategy. When Fannie Lou Hamer described being beaten in jail, she wasn't just sharing her own experience. She was saying, "This could happen to you," or more importantly, "This is already happening to others like me." The effect is immediate: empathy and outrage. Additionally, the language used was accessible and direct. Few flourishes, but a lot of impact. The goal wasn't to impress intellectually, but to spur action. These speeches were more than beautiful words. They were calls to mobilization. This blend of technique and emotion is what makes these speeches rhetorical weapons. They educated, but also ignited. And perhaps that's why the VA stood the test of time, because they spoke to both the mind and the heart. Rhetoric in the civil rights movement went beyond words. It was also about presence, a performance. When leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X took the stage, it wasn't just their words reaching the audience, but also their posture, gaze, and gestures. Every movement seemed orchestrated to amplify their message. This wasn't mere theatrics. It's a technique deeply connected to human psychology. We respond strongly to nonverbal signals. Tone of voice, pacing, cadence, and strategic pauses all play vital roles in the effectiveness of a speech. Malcolm X's firm stance and direct gaze, for example, didn't just command respect, they created a palpable sense of urgency. The charisma of figures like him and King allowed their words to be internalized more deeply. Their physical presence helped the audience feel connected to the struggle, as if they were part of history. The act of delivering a speech itself became an act of resistance. Looking at the most iconic moments of these speeches, it's clear that performance was as essential as content. Words, when spoken with force and feeling, become a powerful instrument. The civil rights speeches didn't just define a historical moment. They had a lasting impact on media and popular culture. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, for example, was broadcast not just on radio and in newspapers, but also on the rising medium of television. That meant his words reached people not only live, but in replay, edited and framed in ways that shaped public perception. The media played a crucial role in building the narrative of the civil rights movement. Television and radio allowed leaders to be seen and heard by audiences far beyond local protests. The movement's words and images were immortalized through these broadcasts, helping define how the struggle for civil rights was perceived nationwide. Popular culture absorbed these ideas and speeches through films, music, and cultural conversations. King's iconic "I Have a Dream" speech became a global symbol of struggle and hope. With quotes and segments frequently cited across various contexts, the movement's imagery was woven into film and music, not only solidifying the importance of these leaders' words, but embedding them into broader cultural memory. And the impact didn't end in the 1960s. These speeches are still quoted and reinterpreted today, proving how the persuasive rhetoric of civil rights leaders transcended time and became part of modern conversations about justice, rights, and equality. The relevance of civil rights speeches remains vibrant today. In a world where racial inequality, civil rights, and social justice are still urgent topics, the words of figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and others remain powerful references. Their persuasive rhetoric not only challenged power structures of their time, but also laid a foundation for future generations fighting for equality and justice. For example, contemporary Black Lives Matter movement uses many of the same rhetorical strategies and protest tactics that were fundamental in the 1960s. The key word here is empowerment. Just as civil rights leaders used speeches to unite and motivate a nation, today's words still have the power to inspire action. We also see a constant adaptation of historic rhetoric to modern contexts. King's "I Have a Dream" now resonates across global movements, connecting struggles for justice and freedom around the world. Yet it's also clear that, despite some progress, systemic racism and discrimination persist in complex, enduring ways. The words of leaders like King are not just remembered, they serve as blueprints for resisting oppression in its many forms. Their transition from radical speech to global human rights manifesto is proof of their lasting power. For students of communications, literature, and related fields, analyzing civil rights speeches offers a rich opportunity to deepen their skills in rhetoric, oratory, and critical analysis. Understanding how leaders like King and Malcolm X used language to shape public opinion and challenge power systems can help students apply similar techniques in their own communication, whether in writing or speaking. Literature students, in particular, can learn how the structure of a speech generates empathy, builds a compelling narrative, and transforms a social issue into a political movement. Studying the linguistic construction, stylistic devices, and delivery methods of these speeches can provide lasting insight into how language changes the world.